The rain came down in iron sheets, the kind of London rain that did not fall so much as collapse from the sky in vertical ruin. Marisol Pendleton stood beneath the meager awning of Crampton's bookshop, with her gloved hand outstretched, fingers spread, watching water sluice off the brim of her bonnet and pool in the cracks between the cobblestones. She had not brought a cloak heavy enough for this. She had not brought a carriage at all. She had brought one umbrella, oiled silk, and scarcely large enough for one, and she was now 12 streets from her lodgings, with no hope of a hackney in this weather, and no coin to spare for one, even if she found it. She drew a breath that smelled of wet wool and coal smoke, and stepped out into the deluge. 3 paces. 4. The umbrella opened above her with a soft snap, and at once the wind caught it, tugging it sideways like a living thing. She gripped the handle hard, ducked her head, and walked on. She did not see the man until she nearly walked into him. He was standing in the middle of the pavement, head bare, dark coat already soaked through across the shoulders. A tall, severe figure, with rain running off his black hair in rivulets, one hand pressed flat against the brick wall behind him, as if it were the only thing holding him upright. There was a thin red line at his temple, washed pale by the rain. His other hand was at his side, knuckles bloodless around the silver head of a walking cane. Marisol stopped. "Sir," she said. "Sir, are you injured?" He turned his head slowly. His eyes, when they found hers, were the color of slate after a storm, dark and flat and very deliberate. He looked at her as though she were a problem he had not yet decided how to solve. "I'm perfectly well," he said. He was not perfectly well. His face was the color of paper. "You are bleeding." "I'm aware." "You are standing in the rain." "I am also aware." She wanted to laugh. She did not laugh. Something in his stillness forbade it. A stillness like a wire drawn very tight, the kind of composure a man wore when he was a single breath from collapse and refused to allow anyone to see it. She had grown up in a house where men wore that kind of composure. She knew what it cost. She held out her umbrella. "Take it," she said. He looked at the umbrella. He looked at her. A muscle moved in his jaw. "No." "You are bleeding from the head, sir, and you are clearly unsteady, and I will not stand in this street debating with you. Take the umbrella." "Madam, I do not require—" "You do require," she thrust it at him. "I have 12 streets to walk, and you have, by the look of it, a carriage somewhere that you cannot reach without falling over. Take the umbrella, find your carriage, and send it back if your conscience demands it. I am quite past caring about my hair." His eyes narrowed, very slightly. It wasn't anger, she thought, with a small, sharp flicker she did not understand, that it was something closer to surprise, as if no one in his recent memory had spoken to him at all in such a manner, let alone a wet woman holding out a battered umbrella in the middle of Charlotte Street. He took it. His glove brushed her glove, and she felt the heat of his hand through 2 layers of leather, which was impossible, and yet she felt it. He held the umbrella over both of them for a single ridiculous moment, and the rain hammered the silk above their heads like applause, and she was suddenly very aware that she was standing closer to a strange gentleman than she had ever stood to any man in her life. "Your name," he said. "Why?" "So that I may return what I owe." "You owe me nothing. It is an umbrella, sir, not an inheritance." "Your name." She hesitated. Then, because the rain was cold and his face was very pale, and she did not, in the end, have the strength to refuse him, she said, "Pendleton. Miss Marisol Pendleton, of number 11 Hadley Row." He nodded once. He did not give her his. "Go home, Miss Pendleton," he said quietly. "You will catch your death. As will you, sir. I am harder to kill than I look." He stepped back, taking the umbrella with him, and the rain crashed down upon her unprotected head with a sudden vicious shock. She gasped. She turned. She walked on, fast, because if she stopped she would shiver, and if she looked back she would feel foolish, and she had been raised to do neither. She did not look back. If she had, she would have seen the gentleman standing very still beneath her umbrella, watching her go, and she would have seen the small movement of his free hand to the inside of his coat, where a folded paper bearing a ducal seal sat against his ribs, and the way his mouth tightened around a word that might have been a name, or might have been a curse, or might have been both. She walked the 12 streets home through the rain. She arrived shivering, soaked through to her stays, and when her landlady, Mrs. Bracewell, opened the door and clucked and produced a towel, Marisol said only, "I gave my umbrella away." "To whom, child?" "A man," said Marisol. "I do not know his name." She would learn it the following morning. She would learn it from the new deed posted in the entrance hall of number 11 Hadley Row, a single sheet of cream paper bearing a ducal seal in red wax, and the news, in the careful copperplate of a London solicitor, that the entire house, every room, every floor, every tenant, including her, had been purchased outright by His Grace the Duke of Asheville. To understand what happened next, one must understand who Marisol Pendleton was, and how she had come to be living in a rented room in Hadley Row at all. She was 23 years old. She had been raised in a vicarage in Somerset, the only daughter of a country curate who had loved Greek and roses, and his wife in roughly that order, and who had died of a fever the autumn. Marisol turned 18, leaving behind £200, a great many books, and a daughter with no fortune, no relations of consequence, and a habit of speaking her mind that her mother had despaired of curing. Her mother had followed her father within the wire, carried off by the same bitter winter, and Marisol had buried her in the same churchyard beneath the same elm tree, and sold the books one by one to pay the rent on a smaller and smaller succession of rooms, until the books were gone, and she had taken a position as a copyist for a publisher in Holborn, transcribing manuscripts in a careful even hand at 3p a sheet. She lived alone. She kept her own hours. She had refused, in the 5 years since her parents' death, 3 offers of marriage, 2 offers of less honorable arrangement, and 1 offer from a cousin, twice removed, to come and live as a kind of decorative aunt to his children in Norfolk. She had refused them all for the same reason. She had not been raised to be grateful. She had been raised to be useful, and there was a great difference between the two. She had seen a duke once, at a distance, when she was 16. He had been riding through the village on a black horse, and she had thought him beautiful and frightening in equal measure, and her mother had pulled her back from the road and said, "Mind, Marisol, those are the men who buy and sell the rest of us, and they don't know they are doing it." She had not forgotten. She had also not forgotten the man under her umbrella. She had thought of him 3 times before she fell asleep that night, once with concern for the wound at his temple, once with embarrassment at the sharpness of her own tongue, and once, briefly and against her will, with a quiet curiosity about the color of his eyes in dry weather. She had then turned her face to the wall and forbidden herself to think of him a 4th time, and had, for the most part, succeeded. She had a manuscript due at Crampton's by Friday. She had a candle that needed replacing. She had a stocking in want of darning. These were the proper concerns of a woman of 23, with £200 to her name, and not a relation in London who could lift a finger on her behalf, and she set herself to think upon them, and she fell asleep at last, with her cheek against the cool linen of the pillow and the smell of rain still in her hair. She did not know that he had ridden home through the rain in a state of cold fury at himself, that he had sat for an hour in his library with the umbrella laid across his knees like evidence, and that by midnight he had summoned his solicitor and given an instruction that would, by noon the following day, make him the legal owner of every floorboard beneath her feet. She did not know, because she did not yet know him, that the Duke of Asheville was a man who, when he could not name what he wanted, bought the ground it stood on instead. The morning was bright in the cruel way mornings sometimes were after rain. Sharp blue sky, every puddle still in the gutter, the air smelling of wet stone and chimney smoke. Marisol came down the stairs in her plain gray work dress, with her hair pinned up still damp at the nape, and she stopped at the bottom of the stairs because there was a small crowd in the entrance hall. Mrs. Bracewell was there, in her apron, with a color high in her cheeks. The two clerks from the second floor were there. The widow, Mrs. Halloran, from the first-floor parlor, was there with her cat in her arms, and the cat was hissing. They were all looking at the wall beside the door, where a sheet of cream paper had been pinned up with 2 brass tacks. "Read it, Miss Pendleton," said Mrs. Halloran. "You read better than the rest of us." Marisol read it. She read it twice. It was a single sheet of foolscap, written in the careful copperplate of a London solicitor's chief clerk, and it stated, in language so dry it scarcely seemed to belong to the matter at all, that the freehold of number 11, Hadley Row, together with the messages and tenements appertaining thereto, had on the previous evening been conveyed, by private treaty and full consideration, to the present owner. The present owner was named in the 3rd paragraph. The present owner had, at the foot of the page, set his seal. Then she said, very calmly, "Whose seal is that?" "Asheville," said one of the clerks, who was a thin youth with ink on his fingers and a great interest in Debrett's. "The Duke of Asheville, inherited 18 months back, lives in Berkeley Square, doesn't go about. They say he's a recluse and a tyrant, and he had a duel last spring with—" "Thank you, Mr. Finch," said Mrs. Bracewell. "That will do. They say also, Mr. Finch went on, lowering his voice and not in the least deterred, that he has not been seen at any rout, ball, or assembly since the title fell upon him, and that his own aunt in Grosvenor Square sends his correspondence back unopened, and that the only person admitted to his house is his solicitor and possibly his physician, and the physician complains that even he is not admitted as often as he should like." "Mr. Finch," said Mrs. Bracewell, with the weary patience of a woman who had heard her clerk recite the contents of Debrett's many times, "if you have a useful observation to make upon the present circumstance, you will make it. If not, you will close your mouth and assist me in thinking." Mr. Finch closed his mouth. Marisol stared at the seal. Red wax, a stag's head. She had pressed an umbrella into a man's hand on Charlotte Street last evening, and she had given him this address, and she had thought him a private gentleman with a head wound and a bad temper, and now there was a stag's head in red wax on her landlady's wall. "He has bought the house," Marisol said. "Apparently," said Mrs. Bracewell, "all of it. Apparently. Including," said Marisol, "the tenants." "Now that," said Mrs. Halloran, "is a turn of phrase, my dear." "It is a turn of fact, Mrs. Halloran." "It is a turn of both, then, which is the most awkward kind." Marisol felt something small and cold begin to rise in her chest, and she pushed it down because her father had taught her that a woman who panicked was a woman who lost, and she was not yet certain whether she had lost. She set her hand against the wallpaper to steady herself. The wallpaper was the color of weak tea. She had stood in this hallway for 2.5 years, and she had never, until this moment, noticed the color of the wallpaper, and she thought perhaps that was because a wallpaper one paid rent upon belonged in some small, invisible way to oneself, and a wallpaper one did not pay rent upon belonged to a stranger, and the difference was very great. There was a knock at the door. Mrs. Bracewell opened it. A footman stood on the step in claret livery, very wet about the boots, holding a folded note on a small silver tray. He bowed precisely the right amount for a household of unknown rank. He was a young man with a serious face, and he had been trained, Marisol thought, by someone who had also trained the man under her umbrella, because there was the same cold composure in him, the same readiness to be looked at without being examined. "For Miss Marisol Pendleton," he said, "with His Grace's compliments." The hall went silent. Even the cat stopped hissing. Marisol took the note. She broke the seal, The stag again, in red. And she unfolded the paper, and she read 3 lines, written in a hand, so disciplined it might have been engraved. Miss Pendleton, I find I owe you an umbrella and an explanation. I shall call at 3 o'clock this afternoon. You may, if you wish, refuse to receive me. Asheville. She read it again. She read it a 3rd time, because the first reading had been to comprehend the words, and the second, to comprehend the courtesy of them. You may, if you wish, refuse to receive me. And the 3rd to comprehend the small, careful thing he had done in writing them, which was to give back to her, in a single line, the choice he had taken away from her with the deed. She looked up at the silent hallway, at Mrs. Bracewell's wide eyes, at Mr. Finch's open mouth, at Mrs. Halloran's slow smile, at the footman waiting in the doorway with the perfectly impassive face of a man who had been trained never, ever to react. Tell his grace, Marisol said, and her voice was steady, and she was rather proud of that I shall be at home at 3. The footman bowed. He withdrew. The door closed. Mrs. Halloran said into the silence, Miss Pendleton, dear, what on earth did you do to that man yesterday? Marisol Pendleton looked at the deed pinned to the wall, at the stag's head, at the red wax, at her own address written in copperplate beneath a duke's signature, and she did not answer, because she did not yet know. But she would. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, she would. He came at 3, not 5 minutes past, not 5 minutes before. The clock in Mrs. Bracewell's parlor was still finishing its 3rd low chime when the carriage stopped in the street, and the same claret-liveried footman opened the door, and a tall man in a dark green coat stepped down onto the wet curb. Marisol watched him from the parlor window, half hidden by the curtain, and she felt a small, unwelcome lurch in her chest that she identified, after a moment of honest examination, as fear. He looked entirely different in dry weather. The wound at his temple had closed to a thin, pale line. His black hair had been combed back severely from his brow. He moved with a careful, even stride that was not quite a limp, and the cane in his right hand was no longer a prop, but a plain article of dress. He did not look up at the window. He did not need to. A man like that, she thought, never had to look. He simply knew when he was being watched, and let it be. Mrs. Bracewell showed him into the front parlor with the wide eyes of a woman who had not, in 20 years of letting rooms, ever shown a duke into anything. She offered tea. He declined tea. He thanked her with a quiet courtesy that emptied her of speech, and she withdrew, and she shut the door behind her, and Marisol Pendleton was alone in a small, wallpapered room with the man who had, that morning, become the owner of her bed. He bowed. Miss Pendleton, Your Grace, I am told that is now the correct form of address. I have not yet grown accustomed to it. That makes 2 of us, sir. A flicker, very small, very quick, at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile. The ghost of where a smile might have lived in a different man. Will you sit? She said. I will stand, if you will permit it. I am not at present comfortable sitting. She remembered then the careful stride and the cane, and she felt a hot, small flush of her own discourtesy. She did not apologize. She had been raised not to apologize for things she had not done. She gestured instead to the fire, and he went to stand near it. And she sat in her father's old reading chair, with her hands folded in her lap, and she waited. He did not make her wait long. I owe you an umbrella, he said. I have brought you one. It is in my carriage. It is, I am told, of better quality than the one you gave me, and you may consider that a debt repaid or an insult according to your temper. And the house? He did not pretend not to understand. The house is not a debt repaid, Miss Pendleton. The house is something else. What then? He looked at her for a long moment. The slate-colored eyes in dry weather were, she noted unwillingly, a very dark gray, with a thin line of black at the rim of the iris, and they didn't move from her face. "I do not yet know," he said. "That," said Marisol, "is not an acceptable answer, Your Grace." "No, I imagine it is not. You have purchased the building in which I sleep. You have purchased the rooms of an elderly widow and her cat and 2 clerks and a landlady who has been here 22 years. You have done this in a single afternoon on the evidence of an umbrella, and you have come here to tell me you do not know why." "I have come here," he said quietly, "to tell you that you are not in any danger from me, that no rent will be raised, that no tenant will be removed, that Mrs. Bracewell will continue as she has done, and so will the rest. The deed is in her name, in trust, with my solicitor as guarantor. I have given instructions that no person under this roof is to be discommoded in any particular by yesterday's decision." "Then why purchase it at all?" He was silent. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt. "You must give me an answer. I am a woman without family or fortune. You are a duke. The disparity between us is such that you may behave entirely as you please, and I may not. If you intended kindness, I will accept it. If you intended something else, I must know now, while I still have the strength to refuse it." He turned his head toward the fire. The line of his jaw was very hard. "I intended," he said, "not to lose track of you." She forgot briefly how to breathe. "That is not kindness, sir." "No. Nor is it quite respectable." "No. And it is certainly not an answer my mother would have approved of. I expect not." She rose to her feet. She did it because if she sat any longer, she would shake, and she would not shake in front of this man. "Your Grace," she said, "you will leave this house. You will take your umbrella with you. You will not return without my invitation. And you will, I think, sit down before you fall, because you have been favoring that leg since you came in, and I have no wish to explain to your physician why a duke collapsed in my landlady's parlor." He looked at her. He sat down. He sat down in the chair she had pointed to, slowly, with the careful movement of a man who had been wounded and was tired of pretending he had not, and he placed the silver-headed cane across his knees, and he closed his eyes for one moment that was not, she thought, weakness so much as a kind of surrender she did not understand. "My name," he said, without opening them, "is Cassian Vale. The title is recent. I did not seek it. I will go in a moment, Miss Pendleton, when the room has stopped tilting. You may, in the meantime, despise me at your leisure." She did not despise him. She wished, with sudden and shocking violence, that she did. 3 days passed. He did not call again. He sent no further notes. The deed remained on the wall, the rents remained unchanged, and Mrs. Bracewell developed a habit of polishing the brass tacks every morning as though they were saints' relics. The widow Halloran's cat resumed its hissing at strangers. Mr. Finch, the clerk, acquired a copy of Debrett's and read aloud at breakfast every entry pertaining to the Vale family, of which there were many, and most were dreadful, until Mrs. Bracewell took the book away and hid it behind the flower. Marisol returned to her work. She walked to Crampton's bookshop each morning with a parcel of finished pages and a fresh manuscript under her arm, and she walked back each evening through the same streets, and she did not look for a tall man with a cane at any of the corners, and she certainly did not feel the small dropping disappointment in her stomach when she did not find him there. She told herself, when she caught herself in the act of not looking, that not looking was what she had asked for. She had ordered him from the parlor. He had gone. He had honored her order by his absence, and she ought to be grateful. And she was, almost. On the 4th day, she found someone else. She had stopped at Crampton's window to look at a new edition of Mrs. Radcliffe's letters, when a voice at her elbow said her name in a tone of warm surprise. And she turned and saw a face she had not expected to see in London for another 6 weeks. "Miss Pendleton, by all that is wonderful." "Mr. Ainsworth," He took her hand. He held it a fraction too long, which was his habit. Theodore Ainsworth was the second son of the squire whose lands had bordered her father's vicarage, a young man of 30 with sandy hair and pleasant features and an expression of perpetual mild amusement, and he had grown up calling her Marisol and pulling her braids and, when she was 19, asking her to marry him. She had refused him. He had taken the refusal with the good humor of a man who did not believe he had truly been refused. He had asked her again at 21. She had refused him again. He had said on that occasion, "I shall ask you a third time, Marisol, when you are tired enough to say yes," and he had laughed, and she had not. "You are in town," she said, withdrawing her hand. "Business. My uncle has me running errands for the family bank. Dreadful, dreadful work. But it has its compensations." He smiled at her. "I had no notion you were in London. Your last letter spoke of Bristol. Plans changed. Plainly." He glanced at the parcel under her arm, at her plain gray dress, at her bonnet, and she watched him do it, and she watched him decide, in the courteous manner of his class, not to remark upon any of it. "Will you walk with me a little? It is a fine afternoon, and I confess I have been hoping to encounter someone who is not a banker." She did not wish to walk with him. She walked with him. She told herself it was civility. She told herself it was old kindness. She told herself a great many things, and underneath them all, there was a small and uncomfortable truth, that for 4 days she had been thinking of a man who had bought her house and given her no explanation, and that the company of an ordinary, harmless, slightly tedious gentleman from her own past was a kind of relief from that. They walked along Charlotte Street. They had reached the corner where, 4 nights earlier, Marisol had thrust an umbrella into the hand of a stranger when a carriage drew up beside them at the curb, a plain, dark carriage with no crest upon the door. And the door opened, and the Duke of Asheville stepped down into the street. He saw her at once. His eyes moved in a single unhurried sweep from her face to Mr. Ainsworth's face to the place where Mr. Ainsworth's hand was lightly cupped beneath her elbow, and the temperature of his expression changed by precisely 1 degree, and a man less observant than Marisol would not have noticed it. She noticed it. She felt it down her spine like cold water. "Miss Pendleton." "Your Grace." "Your Grace?" said Mr. Ainsworth, blinking. "Mr. Ainsworth," said Marisol, "may I present His Grace the Duke of Asheville? Your Grace, this is Mr. Theodore Ainsworth, an acquaintance from Somerset." Mr. Ainsworth bowed. He bowed rather lower than was strictly required. He came up looking faintly stunned, as men often did, Marisol had noticed, in their first encounter with a title. "Your Grace, an honor. I had no idea, Miss Pendleton. Few people do," said the Duke. He did not look at Mr. Ainsworth. He looked at Marisol. "Miss Pendleton, I had hoped to call upon you tomorrow. I find I have a question I omitted to ask. Tomorrow, Your Grace, would be perfectly acceptable. At 3. At 3. Then I shall not detain you now." He inclined his head. He stepped back to his carriage. The door shut. The carriage moved on. The whole exchange had taken perhaps 40 seconds, and in those 40 seconds Mr. Theodore Ainsworth had been measured, weighed, dismissed, and reduced to a small ornamental figure standing on a London pavement. And he did not, Marisol observed with a flicker of something dangerously like satisfaction, appear to understand that any of this had happened. "Marisol," he said, when the carriage was out of sight. "Marisol. The Duke of Asheville. It is a passing acquaintance. He calls upon you. He calls upon a great many people, I am sure. At 3 o'clock. Mr. Ainsworth, I should like to go home." "I shall walk you." "You shall not." She left him standing at the corner with his mouth slightly open. She walked the rest of the way alone, and she did not, on this occasion, mind the rain that had begun, very lightly, to fall again from a sky that had been clear 10 minutes before. She wondered, all the way home, what the question was that he had omitted to ask. He did not ask it at 3. He arrived precisely on the hour, as before, and he was shown into the same parlor, and he was offered the same tea, and he refused it again. He did not, this time, stand by the fire. He sat directly in the chair he had taken on his last visit, and he placed the cane across his knees and folded his gloved hands upon it, and he looked at Marisol with the steady appraising attention of a man reading a contract. "You are recovered, sir." "I'm better." "Yes." "And the question?" "Will come in due course. Your Grace, I have a great deal of work this afternoon. If you have come only to look at me, I had rather you said so." The corner of his mouth did the thing again, the almost smile that was not a smile. "Tell me about the gentleman in Charlotte Street." She had expected a great many questions. She had not expected that one. She felt the color move up her throat before she could prevent it. "Mr. Ainsworth is an old neighbor." "From Somerset." "Yes." "His family bordered yours." "Yes." "He has asked you to marry him." She stared. "I beg your pardon?" "He has asked you to marry him," said the Duke quietly. "More than once. He intends to ask you again. I should like to know whether you have any present intention of accepting him." She rose. She could not help it. She rose, and she walked to the window, and she set her hand against the cool glass to steady herself. And she did not turn for a long moment, because she did not trust her face. The glass was cold beneath her palm. The street outside was empty. She could see, in the wavy old pane, the faint reflection of the man in the chair behind her, and he had not moved. He was watching her back, and she knew he was, and she did not turn until she had governed her face entirely, because she had been raised by a curate's daughter never to give a man the satisfaction of an unguarded countenance, and she would not begin today. "How?" she said at last. "Do you know that?" "It is my business to know things." "It is not your business to know that." "No," he said. "It is not." "Have you had me followed, Your Grace?" "No." "Have you had him followed?" A pause. "Yes." She turned. She was not, she discovered, angry. She was something colder and clearer than anger, and she walked back to the chair opposite him, and she sat, and she folded her hands, and she said, "Explain." He did not flinch. He did not look away. He met her gaze with the same level gray attention he had brought into the room with him, and when he spoke, his voice was very quiet. "3 days ago I instructed a man in my employ to ascertain whether any gentleman of your acquaintance had recently arrived in town. I did not give him the names of the tenants of this house. I did not give him your correspondence. I gave him the streets you walk in and the shops you frequent, which I had observed myself, and I told him to bring me word if a man approached you in any of them. He brought me word yesterday evening. I came to Charlotte Street this afternoon to see for myself." "You came to see for yourself?" "Yes." "Why?" He did not answer. "Your Grace, why?" "Because," he said, with a kind of quiet ferocity that did not raise his voice at all, "if you are going to be persuaded into marrying a man, Miss Pendleton, I would prefer to know the size of the ground I am losing." The room was very still. The fire ticked. A coal fell. Somewhere upstairs, Mrs. Halloran's cat thumped from a windowsill to the floor and complained loudly about the journey. Marisol could not look away from him. "That is not a thing a duke says to a copyist," she said. "No." "It is not a thing a gentleman says to a stranger." "No." "It is not a thing," she said, and her voice was uneven now, and she was suddenly furious at it, "that a man who has known me 4 days has any right at all to feel. I am aware. Then why have you said it?" "Because you asked." "I did not ask. You asked twice." "Why?" "I do not lie to women who ask me twice." She put her hands over her face. She did not weep. She had not wept in the 4 days, and she would not begin now. She kept her hands over her face for the count of 10, because she needed 10 seconds in which he could not see her, and when she lowered them, she had her voice back. "You will leave this house, sir." "Yes." "You will not have me followed again." "No." "You will not have him followed again." "No." "And whatever it is you are feeling, Your Grace, you will set it aside, because I am not a piece of ground, and I am not a debt, and I am not a thing to be tracked through London. Do I make myself plain? Entirely plain. He rose. He bowed. He went to the door, and he stopped with his hand upon the latch, and he did not turn his head when he said, I will not call again, Miss Pendleton, until you summon me. I will continue to honor the deed and the tenancy and the rents, and you will not see me upon Charlotte Street, or in Holborn, or at Crampton's, or anywhere else you walk. You have my word. Thank you. But you should know, he said, still without turning, that Mr. Ainsworth is in London on instruction. His uncle's bank is in difficulty. His family's estate is mortgaged twice over, and the second mortgage is held by a man in Bristol, who will foreclose in March. He has been sent to find a wife. He has a list. You are upon it. The door closed behind him. She sat for a long time in the parlor, alone, with her hands very tightly folded in her lap, and the fire ticked, and the deed on the wall in the entrance hall held its red wax seal up to the gathering afternoon dark, and she did not move until Mrs. Bracewell knocked, an hour later, to ask whether she would take any supper. She would not. She did not summon him. She did not summon him for 9 days. She walked to Crampton's, and she walked home again, and she copied a manuscript on the agricultural improvements of Lincolnshire in a hand so even her employer remarked upon it, and she did not turn her head at the sound of carriages, and she did not look at the wall in the entrance hall, and she did not, on any of the 9 evenings, stand at her window after dark. On the 10th evening, the lamp in her room went out. It was a small matter. The oil had run low, and she had meant to refill it that morning, and she had forgotten. She rose from her chair to fetch the pitcher from the landing, and she had her hand upon the door when she heard the voices below. A man's voice. Low, insistent, not Mrs. Bracewell's, not Mr. Finch's, Mr. Ainsworth's. She stood with her hand on the latch, and she listened, and she heard him say her name to her landlady, and she heard Mrs. Bracewell say, No, sir, Miss Pendleton is not at home to callers this evening, and she heard him say, I have come from Somerset, madam, and I shall not be turned upon a doorstep. And she heard Mrs. Bracewell, who was a small woman of 60, with a cap and an apron, say, Mr. Ainsworth, you will turn upon this doorstep, or I shall have Mr. Finch turn you upon it for me, and you will not enjoy the manner of it. She heard the door close. She did not, for a long moment, move. Then she went down the stairs. Mrs. Bracewell was in the entrance hall, breathing rather hard, with both hands flat against the closed door, as though she expected it to be pushed open from without. She turned at the sound of Marisol's foot upon the stair, and her face was the color of milk. Was that? Yes, dear. Did he? He was put out, Miss Pendleton, but I did not like the way he was put out. He had drink upon him. He had a great deal of drink upon him, and he asked for you by your given name, and I did not care for that. And I did not care for the look of his eye when I said you would not see him. Has he gone? He has gone in the direction of the public house at the end of the street. He will not, I think, have gone far. Marisol stood at the foot of the stairs, with her hand on the banister, and she felt, for the first time in her adult life, the small, clear, cold sensation of being a woman in a city in which she had no protector at all. She went back upstairs. She lit a candle from the embers of her fire, because the lamp was still empty. She sat at her small writing desk, and she took a sheet of paper, and she dipped her pen, and her hand was perfectly steady when she wrote, Your Grace. I find I have a question I omitted to ask. Monsieur Pendleton, Hadley Row, Tuesday evening. She folded it. She sealed it with a wafer because she had no signet. She went back down the stairs, and she put the note into Mrs. Bracewell's hand, and she said, Send Mr. Finch with this, to Berkeley Square, at once. Mrs. Bracewell did not ask which house in Berkeley Square. Mr. Finch went out the back. He came back within the hour with his hat askew, and the news that His Grace had been at his club, that he had been fetched out of his club, that he had read the note in the carriage, and that he was, at this moment, on his way. Marisol sat in the parlor with the candle. She heard the carriage. She heard the door. She heard a voice in the entrance hall, not raised, not hurried, but with a small, flat authority in it that emptied the hall of every other sound. And then his step in the corridor, slower than a healthy man's, and then he was in the doorway. He had not stopped to take his coat off. The dark green coat was buttoned high against the night. His hair was a little disordered from the wind. He did not bow. He did not bow because he was looking at her face, and whatever he saw there made him cross the room in 3 strides and stop a yard from her chair. And he said, very quietly, "What has happened?" Mr. Ainsworth came to the door. When? Half an hour ago. He had been drinking. Mrs. Bracewell turned him away. He has gone to the public house at the corner. He may come back. I do not know. She watched him take this in. She watched his face, which had been carefully blank since the moment he entered, do nothing at all. He did not exclaim. He did not curse. He did not move. He stood in front of her with his gloved hand resting on the silver head of the cane, and he was, she realized after a long moment, taking a small accounting of himself, the way a man takes an accounting before he does a thing he has decided to do. "Where is your landlady?" "In her kitchen." "Mr. Finch?" "In the front room with a poker." "Good," he said. "Good. Miss Pendleton, you will go and sit with Mrs. Bracewell in the kitchen for 1 hour. I shall not enter this room again. I shall sit in the front room with Mr. Finch, and we shall wait. And if Mr. Ainsworth returns to this door, I shall speak with him in the street, and you will not see it, and you will not hear it. At the end of the hour, if he has not come, I shall go away again. Is that acceptable to you?" "Yes." "Are you afraid?" She opened her mouth to say no. She closed it. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. He set the cane against the chair. He took off one glove, slowly, and then the other, and he laid them on the small table beside her, and he did not touch her. He did not so much as brush her sleeve, but he stood there in his shirt cuffs, with his bare hands very still at his sides, and he looked down at her, and he said, "You will not be afraid in this house again. Not while I am alive. Do you understand me, Miss Pendleton?" "Yes." "Say it." "I understand you." "Good." He picked up the cane. He went out. The door closed behind him with the soft click of a latch falling into place, and Marisol Pendleton sat in her chair with 2 empty gloves on the table beside her, and she put her face into her hands, and she did not weep, because she hadn't wept in 5 years, and she would not begin now. But she sat there with her face in her hands for a long, long time, and her shoulders shook in a way that wasn't weeping, but was very close to it. Mr. Ainsworth did not return that night. He had, as it transpired, fallen asleep over a glass of brandy in the snug of the 3 Crowns, and the publican had thrown a coat over him, and he had woken in the morning with a headache, and no clear memory of where he had been, or why. The Duke of Asheville sat in Mrs. Bracewell's front parlor with Mr. Finch and a poker until 2 in the morning. He drank 1 cup of weak tea. He did not speak more than 10 words. At 2 o'clock he rose, took his gloves from the table in the other room without entering it, bowed to Mrs. Bracewell, told Mr. Finch he was a credit to his sex, and went out to his carriage. Marisol stood at her dark window upstairs and watched him go. He looked up. He did not raise a hand. He did not nod. He simply looked up once at the unlit square of her window, as though he had known precisely which window it was. And then he stepped into the carriage and was gone. She slept that night with the empty gloves on the table beside her bed. She did not know why she had brought them upstairs. She did not, in the morning, send them back. He came at 3 the following afternoon. She had not summoned him a second time. He came anyway, because the rules they had set between them had been built for a quieter trouble, and last night had not been quiet. and they both knew the rules no longer applied. Mrs. Bracewell admitted him without speaking. He went to the parlor without being shown. Marisol was already there. She had laid the gloves upon the small table. He saw them. He did not pick them up. "Sit down, Your Grace." He sat. "I have been thinking," she said, "for most of the night. I have decided that I am owed a great many answers, and you are the only person who can give them to me. And I have decided also that I shall not pretend to be calm while I ask for them. Will that suit you?" "It will suit me. Why did you buy this house?" He drew a breath. He let it out. "Because," he said, "when I walked away from you that evening in the rain, I had a bullet in the muscle of my thigh that I had been ignoring for 3 hours, and a slight concussion from striking the corner of a bookcase as I fell, and I had come out of my carriage in Charlotte Street because I could not bear another moment of being looked at by my physician, and I was leaning against a wall trying to decide whether to faint, and a young woman walked out of the rain and gave me her umbrella and called me sir and ordered me to find my carriage. And I wished, with a violence I did not understand, never to lose sight of her again. I did not have a name for the wish. I did not examine it. I went home and gave my solicitor an instruction. By the time I had begun to examine it, the deed was drawn. A bullet. A duel. The previous afternoon. Not my choosing, but I am told no duel ever is. With whom? A man who is no longer of consequence. He is in Calais, I am informed, and may stay there. Why? He looked at the fire. He had said a thing about my mother that he should not have said. I gave him an opportunity to retract it. He declined. The matter is closed. Your Grace. Cassian, he said quietly. If we are to have this conversation, Miss Pendleton, you will use it. She closed her eyes for a moment. Cassian. Yes. Why have you not lost interest? In what? In me. It has been a fortnight. You have seen me 4 times. I have refused you twice. I have ordered you out of this room. I have pulled you back into it. Any other man would have lost interest by now, and any other man would have been right to. I am aware. Then why? He was silent for a long time. Because I am 31 years old, Miss Pendleton, and I have been a duke for 18 months, and before that, I was the second son of a man who did not love me, and the brother of a man who did, and my brother is dead. He died in a phaeton accident in Hyde Park on a Sunday afternoon in April, in front of a great many people, and he was 26, and he was the better of us in every particular, and I inherited a title I did not want, and a great deal of money I did not need, and a house in Berkeley Square that has 53 rooms, and not one of them in which I wish to sit. I have spent 18 months in mourning that I am not permitted to call mourning, because dukes do not weep for younger brothers in any way that other men can see. I have not spoken kindly to anyone in those 18 months. I have not laughed. I have not slept the night through. I have transacted the business of the estate, and I have answered correspondence, and I have sat for my portrait, and I have done none of it as a living man does it. And then it rained on Charlotte Street, and a stranger spoke to me as though I were a person and not a position, and ordered me about as though my consequence were nothing, and refused me an answer, and walked away into the rain. And he stopped. He passed his hand across his face. And I felt something, he said, for the first time in 18 months. I did not know what it was. I do not entirely know what it is now. But I find, Miss Pendleton, that I am terrified of losing it. The room was very still. She did not, for a long moment, speak. She could not speak. She had not known about the brother. She had not known about the duel. She had not known that the cold, severe man across from her had been carrying, behind his face, a grief so heavy it bent the air around him. And she had given him her umbrella, because she had thought him faintly ridiculous. And now he was telling her that her ridiculous umbrella had been the first kind thing in 18 months, and she did not know what to do with it. "You are afraid of me," she said at last. "Yes." "Of what I represent?" "Yes." "Which is?" "A life," he said, "in which I am not, any longer, the man my title says I am. A life in which I am asked questions I cannot answer, and given umbrellas I do not deserve, and ordered to sit down in parlors, and trusted to sit in front rooms with pokers. A life in which I am, perhaps, a person again. I do not know how to want such a life, Miss Pendleton. I do not know how to ask for it. I have not been taught." She rose from her chair. She crossed the small space between them. She stood in front of him, and she did not touch him, but she stood close enough that her gray skirts brushed his knee, and he looked up at her with a face that was not, any longer, the face of a duke. And she said, very softly, "Then let me teach you." He closed his eyes. She lifted her hand. She did not know, until her hand was halfway there, what it intended to do, but it set itself, very lightly, against the side of his face, against the thin pale line at his temple where the wound had been, and she felt him go entirely still beneath her palm, the way an animal goes still that does not believe it is being touched kindly, and she said, "It is only a hand, Cassian." "I know." "Then let it be a hand." "I am letting it." She stayed there for the count of 10. She did not move. He did not move. The fire ticked. Somewhere upstairs, the cat thumped from a windowsill, and then, very slowly, his hand came up, bare, ungloved, and covered hers against his cheek, and he turned his face by perhaps half an inch and pressed his mouth to the heel of her palm, and that was all. That was all. He did not pull her down. He did not kiss her mouth. He did not gather her in. He pressed his lips once to the heel of her hand, and he held her hand there for a moment longer, and then he let it go. "I cannot," he said. "Not here. Not like this. You are in your landlady's parlor, and I am a duke with a bullet hole, and I will not have it said of you that you were ruined by a man who could not even stand up unaided. I will go now, Miss Pendleton." "Marisol! Marisol!" "Yes, I will go now, Marisol, and I will come back tomorrow and the day after, and every day you will receive me, and I will say all of this again, in better words, in a better room, on a better day. And I will, if you allow it, say it every day for the rest of my life. But not tonight. Not in your landlady's parlor. You deserve better than that. And I am, despite all evidence to the contrary, a man who knows what better is." She let him go. She watched him to the door. He took his gloves from the table on the way out. He put them on slowly, watching her over them, and he bowed, and he went. Marisol Pendleton stood alone in the parlor for a long time, with the heel of her hand pressed against her own mouth where his had been, and she discovered, rather distantly, that she was crying. She had not cried in 5 years. She did not, this time, make herself stop. The world did not let them have a single quiet day. The world rarely does. The world had, in this case, a particular reason. For while Marisol Pendleton was crying in her parlor, and the Duke of Asheville was riding home through the early dark of a London evening, with a bare hand pressed against his own mouth, in a manner he would have died before letting any servant see, Mr. Theodore Ainsworth was sitting in the back parlor of a public house in Cheapside, with 3 men in greatcoats and a glass of brandy he could not afford, and he was being asked questions about the woman he had failed to call upon the previous night. The men in greatcoats were from the bank in Bristol that held the second mortgage upon his uncle's estate. They had, that morning, withdrawn their patience. They had given Mr. Ainsworth a number of weeks, 4 to be exact, to produce either a marriage settlement or a sum of money he did not possess. They had named a specific lady. They had named her by her full name and her address and the name of her landlady, and they had said, in the unbothered tone of men who did this sort of thing for a living, that they did not, frankly, mind which lady so long as the figure on the marriage lines was in excess of £7,000. But that Miss Pendleton had been mentioned in his correspondence to his uncle as the most tractable of the candidates, and that they were, on the whole, in favor of tractable. Mr. Ainsworth had drunk the brandy. He had said yes to everything. He had walked to Hadley Row that night with a head full of brandy and a heart full of resentment, and he had been refused at the door, and he had slept in the snug of the 3 Crowns, and he had woken with a headache and no clear plan. But the men in greatcoats had a clear plan, and their plan did not require Mr. Ainsworth's clarity. It required only his presence. He spent the morning of the day that Marisol cried in her parlor writing a letter. He wrote it in a careful, sober hand. He addressed it to Miss Marisol Pendleton of number 11 Hadley Row. He apologized with great and convincing humility for his behavior of the previous evening. He explained that he had received troubling news from his family that morning, and that the news had distressed him into drink, and that he had walked to her door in a state unworthy of his upbringing, and that he was deeply, deeply ashamed. He begged her forgiveness. He begged for 1/2 hour of her time in any public place she chose, with any chaperone she chose, that he might ask her a single question and receive a single honest answer, after which he would never, upon his honor, trouble her again. He sent the letter by a respectable boy. He did not, in the letter, mention the men in greatcoats. He did not mention the bank. He did not mention the 4 weeks, or the £7,000, or the word tractable. The letter was, on its face, the letter of a contrite gentleman. Marisol read it at 4 in the afternoon, sitting at the same desk where she had written, "I find I have a question I omitted to ask." She read it twice. She set it down. She picked it up. She read it a 3rd time. Mrs. Bracewell came in with tea and saw her face and went out again without speaking. She knew, of course, that she should not go. She knew also that Cassian, she had begun, in her head, to call him Cassian, and the name had a weight in her chest that she did not yet trust herself to examine, had told her, in plain terms, what Mr. Ainsworth was. He had told her about the bank. He had told her about the list. She had every reason to put the letter into the fire, and every reason in the world not to step into a public place with a man who had stood drunk on her doorstep at 10 o'clock at night. But she also knew this. She had been raised by a curate's daughter to take a man at his word until he proved otherwise, and Mr. Ainsworth had asked, in writing, in a sober hand, for 1/2 hour and a public place and a chaperone of her choosing, and a single honest answer to a single question. She had refused him twice already in her life. She had not, on either occasion, given him a reason. She had simply said, no. She thought, perhaps, she owed him a reason. She thought also, and she saw this thought clearly, and named it honestly because she was not in the habit of lying to herself, that there was a small part of her that wanted Cassian Vale to know she was a woman who did not need a duke's protection to walk into a coffee house at 11 o'clock in the morning and say no to a man for the 3rd and final time. She wrote her reply at 5. Mr. Ainsworth, I shall meet you at Latham's Coffee House in Russell Street at 11 o'clock tomorrow morning. Mrs. Bracewell will accompany me. You may have your 1/2 hour and your question. After that, sir, the matter is closed between us, in any direction, for the rest of our lives. Monsieur Pendleton? She sent it. She did not send a note to Berkeley Square. That was the mistake, not a great mistake, not a fatal one, but it was the mistake, and she would think of it afterwards. Afterwards, when everything had become very loud, as the moment in which she had quietly, and against her own better instinct, reached for a small piece of her old life, and held it, briefly, in preference to the new one. At 11 the next morning she was at Latham's Coffee House with Mrs. Bracewell at her elbow. At 12 minutes past 11, Mr. Ainsworth was on his knee in front of her. At 14 minutes past 11, Mrs. Bracewell was on her feet, and Marisol was standing, and Mr. Ainsworth had said the words, "If you do not consent, madam, I cannot answer for what becomes of my family, and I cannot answer for what becomes of you." And the door of Latham's coffee house had opened, and the Duke of Asheville had walked in very calmly, with rain upon his shoulders and the silver-headed cane in his hand. He had not, it transpired, been told. He had simply, that morning, gone for a walk. He stopped just inside the door. He took in a single unhurried sweep, the small round table, the chaperone on her feet, the kneeling man, the white face of the woman opposite. And he set his cane very gently against the wall, and he removed his gloves, finger by finger, and he laid them on the nearest empty table, and he said, in a voice that wasn't loud at all, "Mr. Ainsworth, stand up." He did not strike him. He did not raise his voice. He did not, by any motion of his hand or his face, threaten the man at all. But every person in Latham's coffee house, including a fat clergyman in the corner who had been asleep, came to a kind of attention at the sound of that voice, and Mr. Ainsworth came to his feet very quickly and stood in the small space between the tables, with his hands at his sides and a look of pure, dawning dread upon his face. "Your Grace, you will leave this room. You will leave it now. You will not approach this lady again in any street or coffee house or public place in this city for the remainder of your natural life. You will write this afternoon to your uncle in Somerset, and you will tell him that the matter we are about to discuss is between your family and mine, and that he may expect a letter from my solicitor before the end of the week. Do you understand me, sir?" "Your Grace, do you understand me?" "Yes, Your Grace." "Good. Go." Mr. Ainsworth went. He went past the silver-headed cane, past the table with the gloves, past a serving girl who had frozen with a coffee pot in either hand, and he went out into the rain bareheaded, because he had forgotten his hat. The Duke of Asheville turned to the small round table. "Mrs. Bracewell." "Your Grace, will you be good enough to take Miss Pendleton home, and to remain with her until I come, which I shall do this afternoon? I have an errand. It will take me 3 hours." "Yes, Your Grace." "Marisol." She looked up at him. He did not, in front of the coffee house, say anything else. He only looked at her, and his face was the face she had seen across her parlor the night before. The bare face beneath the Duke, the man without the title. And he inclined his head once, very slightly, and he picked up his cane and his gloves, and he went out. The errand took him 5 hours, not 3. It took him to a discreet counting house in Lombard Street, and then to a solicitor in Lincoln's Inn, and then to a private banker in Cornhill. And at the end of those 5 hours, the second mortgage on the Ainsworth estate in Somerset had been bought outright by an agent, acting on behalf of an undisclosed gentleman, and the gentleman in question had given precise written instructions. That Mr. Theodore Ainsworth was to be informed, in writing, that his uncle's debts had been settled in full, that no further demand would be made upon the family, that the gentleman in question expected, in return, no consideration of any kind whatsoever, and that the gentleman in question further required Mr. Ainsworth to remove himself from London within the week, and to remain in Somerset, where he was to make himself useful upon his uncle's land in any honest capacity that suggested itself, for as long as he had legs to walk upon it. The bill came to £7,420. The Duke of Asheville paid it without comment. He went home, he bathed, he changed his coat. He did not eat. At 4 o'clock he was in his carriage. At 4:15 he was at number 11 Hadley Row, and Mrs. Bracewell let him in without a word. And he went up the stairs, because Mrs. Bracewell had said she has gone to her own room, Your Grace, and I think she would rather see you there than in the parlor, if it is not improper. And he had said, it is not improper if you sit on the landing, Mrs. Bracewell. And Mrs. Bracewell had sat on the landing. He knocked once. "Come in." Marisol was at her desk. She had her work in front of her, the agricultural manuscript, but she was not writing. She had a single sheet of cream paper in front of her, with familiar copperplate, and she was holding it as though she did not know whether to keep it or burn it. "This came from me an hour ago," she said. "It is from your solicitor. It says that you have settled a sum of £7,420 upon Mr. Ainsworth's family, on condition that he leave London. Is that true?" "It is true. You did not need to do that." "No. You did it anyway." "Yes." "Why?" He stood by the door. He did not come further into the room. He held his cane in both hands. "Because," he said, "I have spent my life paying for things I did not want. I should like, for once, to pay for a thing I did want, which is a man who would never trouble you again. It is the most expensive thing I have ever bought, Marisol, and the only one I have not regretted. It is too much. Yes, I cannot accept it. You are not asked to. It is not a gift to you. It is a debt I have settled with myself, and you are, mercifully, free of it." She set the letter down. "Cassian." "Yes. I went to that coffee house without telling you. I know. Are you angry?" "No." "Are you hurt?" He was silent for a long time. "A little," he said at last, "but not in any way that signifies. You are a free woman, Marisol. You are entitled to refuse a man without my permission. I would prefer, in future, to know the time and the place, not so that I may forbid it, but so that I may walk past the window and see that you are well. That is all I ask." "Then I shall tell you," she said, "always, from now on. Thank you. And Cassian, yes, come tomorrow at 3. I shall. Properly. Yes, with your hat." There was, just then, the smallest unbending at his mouth, a brief, unpracticed softening that he did not this time try to hide. And he bowed, and he went down the stairs. "Mimasam." Bracewell rose from the landing and let him out, and the deed on the wall in the entrance hall watched him go with its red wax seal, and Marisol sat at her desk and held the letter from his solicitor in both hands, and did not, for some minutes, move at all. He came at 3 the following afternoon. He came every afternoon for a fortnight. He came at 3, and he stayed an hour, and he sat in Mrs. Bracewell's parlor with the door open, and Mrs. Bracewell within hearing in the corridor, and he asked questions, and answered them, and he learned the names of the books on Marisol's shelf, and the names of her parents, and the precise circumstances of her father's death, and he told her, in return, the names of the rooms in Berkeley Square in which he had played as a boy, and the name of the dog his brother had owned, and the name of the inn in Yorkshire where the phaeton had been set down for the last time. And on the 8th day, Marisol said, very gently, "You may stop telling me, Cassian, if it is too much." And he said, "No, it is the first time I have been able to say any of it, and I find I don't wish to stop." The scandal, when it came from a direction neither of them had foreseen. It came from the Morning Post. It came in the form of a paragraph upon the 3rd page, on a Tuesday, under the heading, "A Noble Purchase," in which an anonymous correspondent observed that His Grace, the Duke of A _____, had recently acquired, by private treaty, a small property in the parish of St. Pancras, and that the said property contained, among its tenants, a young person of female sex and modest situation, upon whom His Grace had been observed to call, with regularity and without chaperone of His Grace's own family, upon several recent afternoons. The paragraph did not give Marisol's name. It did not need to. By Wednesday morning, every woman of consequence in Mayfair knew it. By Wednesday afternoon, Mrs. Bracewell had received 3 callers she had never seen before, all of them respectable-looking ladies with footmen, all of them asking, in tons of tender concern, whether Mrs. Bracewell quite realized the kind of arrangement she was harboring beneath her roof. By Wednesday evening, Mr. Finch had come home with a copy of a print sold for 6pence in the Strand, in which a tall, thin gentleman in a coronet stood in the rain with an umbrella over a smaller figure clearly meant for a milliner, and the title of the print was His Grace's Acquisition. Mrs. Bracewell put the print into the fire. Marisol read the Morning Post paragraph twice and went pale. And then she put on her plain gray dress and her plainest bonnet. And she walked, in the middle of the afternoon, the full distance from Hadley Row to Berkeley Square. And she presented herself at the door of the Duke of Asheville's house, and asked the butler, in a voice that was perhaps not as steady as she would have wished, whether his grace was at home. The butler did not blink. The butler had been instructed, 3 weeks earlier, that Miss Pendleton of Hadley Row was to be admitted at any hour of the day or night, with or without invitation, with or without chaperone, without question, without delay, and without comment. He had been a butler for 31 years, and he had received many strange instructions, and he had filed this one in the drawer with the others. And now he opened the door and bowed and said, "His Grace is in the small drawing-room, madam. May I take your bonnet?" Cassian Vale was on his feet before she was through the door. He had a newspaper in his hand. He saw her face. He saw the bonnet. He saw the absence of Mrs. Bracewell. He set the newspaper down without folding it, and he crossed the room to her, and he stopped a yard short, because he had learned in the past fortnight that he was always to stop a yard short until she said otherwise. "Marisol, you have seen the paper? I have seen the paper. Then we must speak about it now, Cassian, because I have been thinking the whole way here, and I have made a decision, and I should like to make it before my courage gives out. Sit down." "I will not sit down. I will stand. If I sit, I shall lose my place." He nodded. He stood. "Cassian," she said, "I know what is being said. I know what will continue to be said. I know that you have been respectful, and that I have been respectful, and that none of that will matter, because we have given the world a story it likes better than the truth, and the world will tell that story for as long as it amuses the world to tell it. I know, also, that you have an aunt in Grosvenor Square who has not spoken to you since you bought my house, and that your cousin in the country has written you a letter of which you have not told me the contents, but which has put a line between your eyes that wasn't there a week ago. I know that you are paying, every day, in the currency of your own family, for the privilege of taking tea in my landlady's parlor. I have known all of this, and I have continued to take the tea, because I am, it turns out, a less honorable person than I was raised to be. Marisol, I have not finished. Forgive me. I have decided, she said, that I cannot continue to take the tea unless we change the terms upon which it is taken. I cannot be your secret, Cassian. I cannot be the woman in the small house who is called upon at 3. I am too proud for it, and I love you too much for it. And if those are the only 2 arrangements available to me, I shall have to refuse them both, and go back to Somerset, and copy manuscripts there and forget you. His face did not move. Are those, he said, the only 2 arrangements available to you? You tell me. No, he said. There is a third. Name it. He went down upon one knee. He did it carefully because of the leg, and she understood the carefulness, and she did not, this time, look away. He took her hand. He took it without asking. His were ungloved. He had not put gloves on since she had come into the room, and she had not, until this moment, noticed. Marisol Pendleton, he said, I have loved you since you handed me an umbrella in the rain, and I will love you, I am quite sure, until I am put into the ground. I have nothing to offer you that is worthy of you. I have a great house I do not know how to fill, and a title I did not earn, and a leg that will not, my surgeon tells me, ever be entirely sound, and a reputation as a tyrant, which I have done absolutely nothing to deserve and nothing to dispel. I have, in addition, a great deal of money, which I am told is meant to compensate for these things, and which I have begun to suspect actually does not. Will you marry me? Will you marry me publicly, and properly, and at once, and let us walk together past every print shop in the Strand, and let the world say of us what it will, because the world is going to say it whether we are married or not, and I would rather be married to you while it does." She looked at him. She did not immediately answer. She looked at the bare hand holding hers. She looked at the line at his temple. She looked at the cane laid carefully on the carpet beside him. She said, "Cassian, you are kneeling on a hard floor. I am aware. Get up. Not until you answer. Then I shall answer. Yes. Yes, of course, yes. I have loved you since you sat down in my landlady's parlor, because I told you to. And I will marry you tomorrow, if you can find a clergyman, and the day after, if you cannot. And we shall go past every print shop in the Strand together, and they may make a print of that as well, if they please. Now stand up. Please. Stand up." He stood up. He stood up slowly, with her hand in his, and when he was standing, she did not let go of his hand, and he did not let go of hers. And they stood like that in the small drawing room in Berkeley Square for a long, uncounted moment. And then, very carefully, he drew her into him, and he set his forehead against hers, and he closed his eyes. "Say it again," he said. "Yes. Again. Yes, Cassian. Once more. Yes." "Thank you," he said. "Thank you. Thank you." He did not then kiss her. He waited until they were married for that, because he was a man who had said, "Not in your landlady's parlor," and meant it, and a small drawing room with a butler in the corridor was no better. But he held her, very gently, against his chest in the center of the room, with one bare hand upon the small of her back and the other in her hair, and Marisol Pendleton stood with her cheek against the wool of his coat and listened to his heart move very fast beneath it, and she thought, distantly, with a kind of wonder, that she had walked 12 streets in the rain a month ago to give an umbrella to a stranger, and she had walked, in fact, the whole of her life. They were married in a private chapel in Berkeley Square upon a Thursday morning, with Mrs. Bracewell as one witness and Mr. Finch as the other, and the Duke of Asheville's aunt from Grosvenor Square not present, and his cousin from the country also not present, and a small, bewildered chaplain who had not, in 40 years of service, ever conducted a ducal wedding in which the bride wore a plain gray dress, and the only flowers were a single bunch of violets that the bride had bought herself from a girl on the corner of Bruton Street that morning for 3d. The chaplain said the words. They said the words back. The Duke of Asheville kissed his Duchess upon the mouth in front of God and Mrs. Bracewell, who had been a widow for 20 years and a landlady for 22, and had not expected, ever again, to weep at a wedding. Wept, rather, a great deal. The scandal lasted 6 months. It lasted 6 months, and then it stopped, partly because the Duchess of Asheville turned out to have an extremely steady eye, and a way of looking through the women who had cut her in the street that emptied them, slowly, of the will to do it. Partly because the Duke of Asheville turned out to be a man who could, if he chose, ruin a bank by lifting his pen, and chose twice to demonstrate it. And partly because the Dowager Duchess, Cassian's mother, who had been in deep retirement in Hampshire, and who had, upon receiving her son's letter, traveled to London in 2 days at her age, which was 68, arrived at Almack's upon the arm of her new daughter-in-law, wearing the veil diamonds, and a face that dared any patroness in the room to remark upon it, and no patroness did. The aunt in Grosvenor Square came round in the 7th month. The cousin in the country came round in the 9th. By the end of the year, there were prints in the Strand again, but the prints were respectful, and Marisol kept one, framed in her dressing room, of a tall gentleman with a cane, and a small woman in gray, walking together in the rain beneath a single umbrella, with the title, A Wet Afternoon in Mayfair. She did not, ever, give the umbrella back. He had bought her another, of better quality, on the very first afternoon, and had it sent in a long box. She used the new one. The old one, The oiled silk umbrella she had thrust into a stranger's hand on Charlotte Street upon a Tuesday evening was kept in a glass case in the small drawing room of the house in Berkeley Square, with a small brass plate beneath it, bearing no name and no date, only one line in his hand. She gave it to me before she knew who I was. He liked, in the evenings, to sit in the small drawing room with a book, and to look at the case occasionally over the top of the page. She liked to sit beside him. They liked, both of them, to be in rooms together without speaking. They did not, in the end, sell the house in Hadley Row. They could not bring themselves to do it. They paid Mrs. Bracewell a salary instead of a rent, and they kept the rooms exactly as they were, and Mr. Finch was promoted to under-steward of the Berkeley Square household, and the widow Halloran's cat was given, in its old age, the freedom of the kitchens at Asheville Park, where it lived another 4 years, and bit, on one celebrated occasion, the heel of a visiting bishop. The deed remained on the wall of the entrance hall of number 11 Hadley Row, with its red wax seal. Mrs. Bracewell continued to polish the brass tacks every Saturday morning until the day she died, which was a very long time later, in her sleep, in the small bedroom at the back of the house, with a duchess sitting beside her bed, holding her hand. On the second anniversary of the wedding, they went back to Hadley Row. They walked the 12 streets from Berkeley Square. They did not take the carriage. It was raining, not the iron rain of the first afternoon, but a soft autumn rain, the kind that smelled of leaves, and Cassian carried the umbrella, the new one, and Marisol walked under it with her arm through his and her hand on his sleeve. They reached the corner of Charlotte Street. They stopped. "Here," she said. "Here." "You were leaning on that wall." "I wasn't leaning. I was standing in a manner that strongly resembled leaning." "You were leaning, Cassian, as you say." She smiled. He looked down at her under the umbrella. He had developed, in 2 years of marriage, a habit of looking at her that began at the crown of her head and traveled, slowly, to the line of her mouth, and it still, even now, made her flush a little, and he still found the flush a satisfactory return upon the looking. "Marisol, yes, if you had not given me the umbrella that night. I know. I should have stood there until I fell down, and I should have been picked up by my coachman, and I should have gone home, and I should have continued to be the man I was. I should not have known." "Known what?" "That I could be otherwise." She set her gloved hand against his cheek. She did it in the middle of Charlotte Street, where any number of people could see. None of them were looking. London never looks when it matters. "You would have known," she said. "Eventually, someone else would have given you an umbrella." "No," he said. "There was only one woman in London that night who would have done it, and she did it, and I have spent the rest of my life thanking her." "You have spent 2 years thanking me, Cassian. I have a great many years left. I know, and I shall thank you in every one of them. I know that, too." He kissed her. Then, in the middle of Charlotte Street, under her own umbrella, in the soft autumn rain, and a passing crossing sweeper paused with his broom to watch, and then, smiling, went on. And a woman in a milliner's window looked up from her ribbons and smiled too. And the Duke and Duchess of Asheville stood for a moment longer at the corner of Charlotte Street, and then they walked on together to Hadley Row, where Mrs. Bracewell had the kettle on, and the deed was on the wall, and the cat was hissing in the parlor at someone neither of them could see. "Thank you for staying with Marisol and Cassian until the very end." Their story began with a single umbrella in the rain, a small kindness given to a stranger by a woman who had been raised to give such kindnesses without expecting anything in return. But the truth, as the truth often is, was simpler and more terrible than that. They were not brought together by an umbrella or a deed or a duke's careful ledger of debts. They were brought together because 2 lonely people looked at one another in a strange afternoon and saw, beneath the rain and the bandage and the plain gray dress and the silver-headed cane, a person, and decided, without quite knowing they had decided, that the person was worth coming back for. If you stayed until the end, thank you. If this story moved you, even a little, please consider subscribing. There are many more nights like this one waiting for you. Many more strangers with umbrellas. Many more dukes who do not know yet that they are about to be saved. Hit the bell. Tell us in the comments which moment broke your heart and which moment put it back together. We read every one. We are grateful for everyone. And we will see you very soon in the next story. Good night.